I actually suspect that the top clubs in Germany will do a lot of business over the next few weeks. And one of those clubs is Bayer Leverkusen, where we're really going to focus on today. And there's so much going on. And, like with the two big names that are at the very forefront of this are Florian Wirtz and Javi Alonso. Some might say they're connected. I'm not quite sure that's 100% accurate. The Florian Wirtz thing is something that, I mean, we just go into our Substack chat and it's 24/7, isn't it? Florian Wirtz did say that. Florian Wirtz feels this. Florian Wirtz's dad met Uli Hoeneß at the Tegernsee, not once, but twice. Florian Wirtz prefers a move to Bayern. Florian Wirtz prefers a move abroad. Florian Wirtz was spotted drinking tea, so therefore he's going to England. Florian Wirtz was spotted in a Spanish tapa place, so therefore it's Real Madrid. We're entering this kind of nonsensical talk. Very little's actually been said. I have to say, in public at least. There was a report that came out, I think yesterday in the Tageszeitung, it might have been today. These days all merge into one, especially over Easter, where it was said that his preference was to go abroad. This isn't exactly news. There's been reports like this in the past. There seems to be a lot of reports suggesting that his family would like him to stay in Germany, whereas he himself would rather go abroad. Not have an in-between step at Bayern Munich. There's also some reports saying out there, like, look, he's actually going to stay at Bayer Leverkusen. So what's this all about? In other words, Stefan, it's a lot of noise. There's a lot to cut through and a lot to analyze. And at the end of the day, to be quite frank and honest with you, I'm not sure whether we're really actually going to come to a conclusion on where he's actually going to go and what his plan is. I still think the ultimate plan is for him to stay in Leverkusen until 2026. That can change with one phone call and one decision and one family gathering, really. But I think that's still where we're at. But I also think, when it comes to his next decision, I think there is going to be a lot of debate whether it's going to be Bayern Munich or a step abroad.
Yeah, it's kind of been something that's rumbled on for years now, and it does kind of feel like the reports are beginning to kind of narrow in on the side that it won't be Bayern Munich, and that's something we've been saying for quite a while now. I think both of us have been very sceptical of the idea of Bayern actually signing him for a number of reasons. We've talked about it on the show countless times, but I think the stats all kind of stack up, or rather the factors all kind of stack up against Bayern for a number of reasons. You can go through them all. There's the fact that the first things first is that he would probably cost about 150 million euros, and one of the reports that had come out today saying it wouldn't be Bayern kind of narrowed in on that and said that Leverkusen are reportedly quite angry that Bayern have kind of leaked to the press almost that they'd only be willing to pay 110 million because that's what they think he's worth, which is this kind of, it's just this kind of classic Bayern, kind of playing the media card thing.
Yeah.
But there's something to that in the sense that, yes, Bayern are one of the richest clubs in the world, and yes, they pay some of the biggest wages in the world, but in recent years, they haven't really gone down the route of going toe-to-toe with the likes of PSG or Manchester City or even Real Madrid, really, when it comes to kind of paying the very top prices for the very best players in the Bundesliga. Now, I know that seems silly to say because they just spent 100 million euros on Harry Kane. I would say that was a bit of an exception, to be perfectly honest with you, because I think Kane was like a exceptional opportunity for them, which they obviously jumped at. But, you can go through the number of players who've left Germany in recent years, Guardiola and Kunku, Erling Haaland, Jude Bellingham, guys like that. Even going all the way back to Havertz. And in most cases, Bayern were heavily linked with these guys, and they ended up moving elsewhere.
Although with Haaland, I think it came really close.
Well, yeah, I'm sure.
Really close. I think it was really just between them and Man City. So that is the one where I'm like, that could have ended up differently. But the other ones, you're totally right.
Yeah. No, and look, I'm not saying that Bayern aren't a desirable place to play. Of course they are. But it's really down to Bayern how much they want to put the boat out for these guys. I think the other thing as well against Bayern is that you just only have, I said this on social media, you have to look at that squad, and there's two or three guys playing in that position that Florian Wirtz wants to play in. And you know, as I said on social media, it's three guys in Gnabry, Leroy Sané, and Kingsley Coman who are all making between 15 and 20 million euros a year. And this isn't Football Manager. You can't just put them all up for sale, set for free, click and say offer to clubs, and then suddenly 20 clubs offer to sign these players. They've all got huge contracts, they've all got huge deals on them, and each and every one of them would be very hard to move on without Bayern still having to pay a degree of their contract, unless a Saudi comes along or maybe a silly club from the Premier League, which is by no means out of the realms of possibility. But
Yeah.
for Bayern to move on all three of those players in the summer and still spend the money on Florian Wirtz, I think would be a big ask. And then, of course, the fact is, another fact I wanted to bring up was just the fact that he's already won the Bundesliga. He's won the Bundesliga with Leverkusen. He's done that. He's ticked that off his box in terms of his career. And his next goal will be the Champions League. And yes, Bayern are one of the biggest clubs in Europe, but there are other clubs as well that can offer the prospect of challenging for the Premier League. The Champions League. Manchester City are one of them. PSG. Well, although I don't think it's going to be PSG. Real Madrid, Barcelona, if you will, as well.
Yeah.
So I just think the odds were always stacked against Bayern in this case, and that's without even really talking about the fact that Bayern already have their Florian Wirtz and Jamal Musiala, which would be an interesting kind of dynamic to it. But I don't know. It's just always struck me as quite odd, and I don't know, man. I wonder what you think on this. I kind of made a joke on social media being like, hold on, I was like, so you're telling me that months and months and months of speculation, reports, columns, quotes from former players about Wirtz were all speculation. And it's like, it felt like the kind of the Munich media bubble kind of, it does this. It gets itself into a frenzy in both ways, not just in propaganda for Bayern. How many times have we sat here this season talking about players that were definitely leaving Bayern, only signing their contract? So it works both ways, but it feels like these media bubbles just work themselves up into a frenzy without ever considering the facts.
Well, you said it in the past. It's an industry, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think
it's a one club town. It's a one club town, and that's what happens with these places.
but you have the same in Spain with Real Madrid, right?
Yeah.
And then less extent Barcelona, but there's entire newspapers in Spain that have to fill 20 pages of Real Madrid news every single day. And that is a club, and I mentioned this in the subscriber chat, that is a lot less leaky these days. There was a time where that's different, but these days I think Real Madrid run a really tight ship. And we know this because we have colleagues that work in Spain, right, and deal with Real Madrid at a pretty good level, I think, that get the information they need to get if Real Madrid is ready, when Real Madrid are ready to hand it out. But other than that, they run a really tight ship, and which is why a lot of times when you read reports out of Spain, even from serious sources, they can be really off, because it's when Real Madrid wants something to come out, it's only to favor them. Whereas at Bayern Munich, the club doesn't always speak with one voice, and I think that is something that you always have to consider here. There is a lot of powerful figures that work for the club. We don't even include the guys that have worked for the club or have played for the club, who also have a lot of influence in German football. So, the club doesn't always speak with one voice, and they air their laundry in public. And that's a lot of that is going on at the moment. There was a time where that wasn't the case, where Uli Hoeneß run a very tight ship. The Bild would have their reports, but they would have it, player X gets signed, here you go, report it, right? Nowadays, it's not like that. And you have, let me just list the dailies in Munich is, the Abendzeitung, Tageszeitung, Merkur, and Bild, that all have to fill lots and lots of pages on Bayern Munich, and to a lesser extent 1860, but 1860 gives them lots to report on, so that's not a problem. And so they have to all find their sources and phone with their sources, and that doesn't even include some of the bigger newspapers like the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which is one of the big newspapers in Germany, that also probably write one or two big features on Bayern Munich. They don't do the speculation part the same way, but they have a podcast, they have their big features, etc. They have probably a big interview with a Bayern Munich player every 2 weeks or so, right? And so, as you said, it's an industry, and because you don't have everyone speaking with one voice, that's why you get all these reports coming out. And look, Bayern Munich would love to have Florian Wirtz. That's the bottom line. I think from an economic point of view, this is a signing that they would love to have because ahead of the World Cup in the United States, which commercially is really, really important for the club, really important for the main partner, Adidas, right? Who's not just a sponsor, but also a shareholder. Both Jamal Musiala and Florian Wirtz are Adidas guys, right? So like, this is where we're coming from here. But, I also think, and this is the other part of the story, it would be the final nail in the coffin to put the Bundesliga to grave if Florian Wirtz ends up at Bayern Munich. And, as good as it would be for Bayern to have the best players, I think it would really hurt the league commercially. And I also do think that you have to factor in Florian Wirtz in this conversation. We can debate until next day or whenever, or as you always like to say, the cows come home, whether Florian Wirtz or Jamal Musiala are the better of the two players. But from a commercial perspective, I think the Jamal is probably going to be the more attractive of the two if they play at the same club. We had this debate with Neymar and Lionel Messi, right? When Neymar was always overshadowed by Messi, and yeah, we all know now Messi was the better player. But the point I'm trying to make is it's really hard for a player to shine at a club where there's already a superstar. And Wirtz will notice, the family will notice, they will know their commercial interests as well. Florian Wirtz and Jamal Musiala at the national team, that's probably good enough from a commercial perspective. And I can see the family saying, like, look, you can go to Bayern, you can hang out with Jamal, with your best buddy, and play football, and but there is a chance that he will not be the main guy. And I think that is something that he will have to consider. Now that can also happen at Real Madrid, especially with Kylian Mbappe there, right? Real Madrid, by the way, an Adidas club, something to keep in mind. Not quite sure the same thing would happen at Man City, especially with Kevin De Bruyne gone there, right? And that is, I think, and you have alluded to this in the past, something to consider. If when Kevin De Bruyne leaves the club, who is the most natural fit to replace him in the world?
Yeah, I mean, there's Phil Foden there, but he's really struggled this season. And it kind of feels a bit like he's missed that opportunity to be the Kevin De Bruyne step in, because he's just went off a cliff in terms of performances this season. And Guardiola has always been kind of very reserved to kind of play him as his main man. So, I did suggest this a few weeks ago that Wirtz would fit in perfectly at Man City. And some people said, well, how can you play him at number 10? I'm like, Wirtz doesn't play as a number 10. He plays out left. That's where he likes to play for Leverkusen. I think people forget that at times, So he'd happily play out left, Haaland up front, maybe Foden through the middle, then Marmoush on the right. And, you've got a very dynamic front line there. And yeah, I think that, and like that's just something that I think also gets overlooked when all this transfer speculation is so loud and incessant. It's like, let's just get down to basics here. Which club can literally make space for him in their squad? That's the key. That's the number one issue here, because, like I said, it's not Football Manager. These clubs can't just buy and sell players en masse as if they're walking into a grocery store or walking into their old kind of GameStop and want to trade in their old games. Like that's not how the transfer market works. The transfer market rather works. You have to kind of you have to work for months and months and months just to move some players on that you don't want. And some clubs can, just simply drop these guys on the reserves or send them out on loan, and they can pay the wages for them when they want to. But Bayern Munich are just not one of those clubs, and I don't suspect Real Madrid are either. They've already, as you said, they've got a lot of players there. So, for example, like Real Madrid, perfectly plausible destination for him, especially if Xabi Alonso goes there. But they would have to move on Vinicius Junior. They'd have to sell Vinicius Junior. And I know people will be listening to this thinking, oh, well, that's fine. Saudi Arabia want to sign him. They'll buy him. Yeah, it doesn't quite line up like that all the time, because Vinicius Junior might not want to go to Saudi Arabia. He might want to win more Champions Leagues. He might want to stay in Europe. Maybe he doesn't, and he doesn't want to go, and they sell him for 200 million, and then Florian Wirtz the perfect replacement. But that's a lot of ducks to line up in a row for these things to work out. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is we don't really know what's going to happen. And as you said about 15 minutes ago, he might end up staying. But I think it's just
I
for
still
now.
think that's the most likely outcome.
Yeah, I probably do too as well, to be honest, unless Man City get really serious about signing them. But
Yeah, but Man City could be the sort of. So here's the thing about Man City, and this is also true for Real Madrid. They're both probably willing to wait for a year.
yeah, probably they've got plenty of players there. I mean, the thing about Man City is I think they will spend a lot of money in the summer because they've been dreadful this season. But they did spend a lot of money in January. They signed a lot of players that they already kind of need. They signed a couple of central defenders which they needed.
Yeah.
They obviously signed Marmoush. So they've maybe already kind of begun that rebuild and already maybe spent the money they planned on spending in the summer. So yeah, you're right. They might hold off as well. But it might come down to another person who might be leaving Leverkusen in the coming months.